figure out their semantics. For example, are generics implicit quantified sentences, or are they predications? What kind of generalizations do they convey? And how many members of the predicated kind or group have the given property? And also lately, I've seen people discussing also about whether or not we can have a unified theory of the meaning of generic statements. But I'm not interested in semantics. I'm interested in the pragmatics of generics. So these are the two questions that I'm concerned about. What do generics do in our conversations? And if we want to improve our language along moral and political lines, what role do generics have in that improved language? So my focus is going to be social generics, generics involving social groups or kinds, like women are submissive, or women have trouble getting tenure in philosophy, for example. Is it noisy? Can you hear a lot of noise outside? Okay, good, because I'm with an open window.
It's perfect.
Okay, so far it's okay. When my neighbors start talking, I'm sorry. Anyway, so social generics evil theirs. I mean, how many bad things they do has been pointing out, also how many good things they can do. But what I wanna, and I'm gonna go into the details soon. So what I wanna ask is, can we keep generics with only the good things? And so the guiding question is, can we remove the problems generics have, social generics have, and keep their benefits in order to have a better language? And our answer is going to be yes. So this is going to be the roadmap. First, I'm going to talk about bad things or problems generics have. Second, I'm going to try to provide a non-exhaustive taxonomy of possible linguistic interventions and how they are implemented with regard to generics. And then I'm going to present our proposal of what to do with generics. So generics are said to promote oppression, mostly because they trigger essentialist thinking. So the idea is that by default, generic statements, in particular social generics, are interpreted as if they are talking about some inherent, deep underlying nature of the group or kind you are predicating the property. So when we say women are submissive, we are talking about the nature of women. So that's the default interpretation, according to all that research in psychology. And what is interesting is that in both adults and children, we essentially groups when we hear generics about them, even when we are talking about novel groups about which we don't even have social norms or prejudices about. So what happened with essentialist thinking is that is connected to prejudice, to infrahumanization of outgroups, and to stereotypes. So in general, the idea is that social generics promote oppression. Also, generics can impair performance because they can trigger also stereotype threat. So for example, if you ask a girl to play a novel game, but you say boys are really good at this game, then you are triggering a stereotype threat, and that means low performance. So, it seems that social generics are pretty bad. And it's not surprising that some researchers have labeled generics are politically problematic. So let's now move on. We'll go back to the many evils of generics, to that taxonomy of linguistic interventions I'm thinking about. So when a linguistic tool is problematic, if we want to improve our language, we can propose, or we can confront this linguistic tool in many different ways. For example, we can say, let's avoid that. Let's eliminate that from our language. And this is something that we've seen that has been proposed about slurs, for example. If slurs not only reflect existing oppression, but also cause it, or even constitute oppression, we better get rid of slurs from our language. The second strategy would be replacement or amelioration. You say when a word meaning pair is problematic, let's just change it. And we see this strategy in the many attempts that we are witnessing about to improve the term woman, its meaning, because we see that it's problematic along the lines of exclusivity or inclusivity, that is not inclusive enough. A third strategy is what we can say a not unified strategy, or the selection strategy. That means, this problematic tool is problematic only sometimes, not always. So there's going to be a selected number of this tool that is actually good. For example, we can say that we see this in the reappropriation of slurring terms. So you say sometimes in some contexts, some utterances of slurs are okay, and they are even good. Mihaela can say much more about this because he has worked on this. About sometimes reappropriating a term can have a lot of benefits for the target group, but other utterances of that term, they don't work. So that would be the idea. We cannot have a unified strategy about what to do maybe with slurring terms, because some utterances are going to be good for the group and other utterances are going to be really bad. So in relation to genetics, we see all these three strategies being proposed. So for example, elimination or avoidance of genetics. Haslanger has proposed such a thing. She proposed that we should abandon racial and gender genetics, even when they are true, or maybe especially when they are true, because of the problems that they bring. So a genetic like women are submissive invites the interpretation that there is something in the nature of women that make them submissive. And this actually coincides with the dominant view in psychology that genetics are by default interpreted in essentialist terms. So the idea would be just let's get rid of them. Let's not use social genetics in our improved language. So the replacement or amelioration of genetics, we've also seen that. So we see this work by Lanton, Haslanger, and Anderson, if I understand it well, says that we better substitute or change generic expressions for explicitly quantified statements, so that we don't convey the essentialist beliefs. And then the selection strategy, I think it has been recently proposed by Ritchie, saying that, actually genetics are our best tool to capture systematicity in oppression and injustice. So quantified statements cannot do that. So we better keep genetics, not all of them, only the good ones, and so we can keep doing this work of pointing out and identifying the systematic structural oppression. Jennifer Saw also proposed this, that we should social genetics are good to point out, to identify, and to pursue social injustice. So these are, for example, two of the examples of good genetics that Ritchie points out. Blacks face economic, legal, and social discrimination, and women are expected to want children. Now, briefly, these are the problems that I see in these three strategies that have been proposed specifically for genetics. So the problem with elimination, the first strategy, is that like all linguistic interventions that involve some drastic change, it risks not being feasible, right? Like it's going to be really difficult to change the way we talk, because genetics seem to be pretty common tools that we use to communicate. But furthermore, it seems that genetic language is connected to our to very primitive cognitive mechanisms for generalization and categorization. So if we ban genetics, it seems that we are going to go against deeply ingrained psychological mechanisms. So it seems that it's going to be extra difficult to remove genetics from our language. Then the problems with replacement. So proposal for converting genetics into quantified statements face the above difficulty of going against this deeply ingrained psychological mechanism, but also well, actually, this is, yeah, I wanted to mention this, why this is going to be difficult. There are interesting experiments about how non-generic quantified statements actually are remembered as generics and interpreted in essentialist terms. There are several different studies on that. So that is scary if you want to get rid of generics, because it seems that you cannot, even when you turn them into quantified statements. So again, this is something that has been suggested by psychologist, philosopher Leslie, that it seems that generics express cognitively default generalizations. So they are really, really beloved by us. You know, we really need generics to express how we think. But also, if we replace generics for quantified statements, not only is going to be difficult, but also we're going to lose what seems to be the best of generics, which is this capacity to capture the systematicity in structural operation, as pointed out by Ritchie. Now, but what are the problems with a proposal like Ritchie's of, you know, this idea of there are some generics that are good, so let's actually use them. She actually proposed we should use those generics, the good ones. So the idea is that this selection strategy is not telling us what makes those generics good, what makes them good as opposed to bad. So there are different things we could look into to explain why some generics, like the ones proposed by Ritchie, are good. Like, for example, Blacks face economic, social discrimination. Is it something about the predicative property or maybe the verb? Because, you know, we see a clear difference between common generics like Blacks are poor, which definitely seems to convey these essentialist beliefs about the group. We see a huge difference compared to the good generics proposed by Ritchie, such as that Blacks face economic, legal, and social discrimination. So maybe it's about the property predicated, maybe it's about the verb that we are using. But anyway, I think the focus on the content of the property or the verb is not helping us to decide which generics are keepers, which generics are good or bad. Because it seems we have to go case by case and try to understand, you know, is this verb maybe in this language or in that language anyway. So I think it's not a problem. I see that as rather a limitation, but not necessarily a problem of this strategy, but a limitation. And of course, I need to find something wrong with Ritchie's in order to introduce my own proposal, right? So maybe this is not that important. Anyway, so our proposal is to re-explain generics. So the idea is we can keep social generics in our improved language with a twist. So instead of abandoning or changing or promoting only a selected group of generics, we propose to re-explain them. And this proposal is expanding on empirical work done by my collaborator and in her lab on structural thinking. So contra the dominant view that generics are by default or always or necessarily interpreted in essentialist terms, what they found out is that generics do not necessarily convey essentialist beliefs. Generics can be interpreted in structural terms. That means that we can explain, or generics do not always convey essentialist beliefs. They can convey a different kind of connection between the group and the property that is being predicated. In particular, they can convey that connection is there because of structural social factors, not because of some inherent nature. So for example, look at this generic. Women have trouble getting high-level managerial jobs. So this is, we might see this, the picture of who says that is clearly with the intention that you interpret this generic in essentialist terms, right? So that would be what the dominant view in psychology says. This is how generics are usually interpreted. Now, we can totally see that same generic being uttered by a completely different person in a completely different context with completely different trying to convey a completely different idea, that women have trouble getting high level managerial jobs because of structural factors that prevent them from actually getting that job. So this would be, these are the two different interpretations, right? The essentialist interpretation and the structural interpretation. So the idea is that the key to induce one interpretation or the other is the explanation that is accompanying the generic statement. That's what they found out in these studies. So when we see women have trouble getting high-level managerial jobs, we might see the explanation such as because women are risk averse, that would be essentializing the category, or because women occupy a social position that constrains their opportunities in different ways. That would be a structural interpretation. So again, we might say women, imagine this other generic, women quit their jobs when they have children. We can explain that as because they are nurturing, because they prefer to take care of family as opposed to their career aspirations. Or you can say because of how family live or parental leave is structured, or all the expectations about women in the all the work that women are supposed to do at home. This is what actually women have no other way but doing, giving up their careers or quitting their jobs for a partial time job in order to take care of that. So the idea is then that genetics are compatible with two interpretations: an internalist or leading to essentialist beliefs interpretation and a structural interpretation. We can explain this for appealing to different reasons. Here we hypothesize that this flexibility between these two interpretations is the result of genetics being underspecified. So they are underspecified between, are we talking about the category woman or the social position woman? And here, it might be very useful to go back to Sally Haslanger's proposal of amelioration of the term woman in 2000, that she defined the category woman in terms of the social position that women occupy. So if we are talking about women as a category, then that's when the risk of essentialization comes. Essentialization, is that a word? Essentialization. It sounded weird anyway. So, but if we are talking about the social position, that's a different story. Then essentializing beliefs, they don't come as easy. Then we are going to think about, what factors are affecting that social position. So basically the idea is that the category woman is locked in a specific social position. I mean, the category woman and many other social categories. So they are locked in specific social positions. And when we are talking, so genetics do not specify what they are talking about, whether the category or the social position. But with the help of an explanation, then we help specify what we are talking about. And when we invite the different interpretations. So one of the things that I think is interesting about that, about this empirical research about genetics, thinking from the perspective of a person who is interested in linguistic interventions, is that genetics are linguistic tools that they have the potential to do good or bad, for falsity or for truth, like many other linguistic tools. And I think that's a much more interesting picture than one in which a specific linguistic tool is like always bad. So what determines whether a social genetic is going to be good or is going to deserve being part of this improved language is not in itself, but in the explanations that accompany that genetic, or the invitations to explanation. So the advantages of re-explaining genetics and are that we get to keep our beloved genetics that if we follow Ritchie, they are really good at capturing systematicity in social dynamics. We also don't challenge our basic cognitive mechanisms for generalization and categorization. We also get a unified approach to the usage of genetics, which is good given the mess that seems to be in the semantics of genetics. So according to Sterken, actually, we cannot even aspire to have a unified theory of the meaning of genetics. So it could be fun, it could be good to have a unified account of the usage of the pragmatics of genetics. And also, I see re-explanation of genetics as an intervention that is not only cleaning up our language, it's also providing something good. It's not only removing the problems of genetics, it's also adding critical information, because when we explain a genetic in structural terms, we are making structural factors salient, and we are making the person in front of us reflect not only on the language that they are using, but also on social factors that might be affecting the group they are talking about in ways that maybe they were not thinking about in that moment. So there are three questions that I'm interested in, and I only covered two of them so far. So we've been talking about what is cognitively possible. It is cognitively possible to interpret genetics in non-essentialist ways. That's already super cool. And the other question I talked about was whether an improved language should contain social genetics. And the question is yes, as long as we promote these structural genetics as opposed to the essentialist genetics. But a question I haven't talked about, and it should be part of my future, one of my future projects, is how to use genetics and how to respond to them in dialogical context. So it was very interesting to hear Bianca talking about blocking and proto-blocking, because I've been thinking, can we use structural genetics as counter speech? So someone says a social genetic, can we provide the structural explanation saying, oh, did you mean this, as a way of counter speech? But it could be, could re-explanation be less costly than the blocking? Bianca has been talking about the cognitive and also the social cost of blocking. Could re-explanation be seen as an invitation to unpack or to make explicit some kind of problematic assume or implicit explanation, essentialist explanation? Or is it something else? Maybe it's less socially costly, but maybe some kind is maybe seen as providing unsolicited information. Maybe it's like, yeah, I know what you're talking about. I know about social factors, whatever. So I think I'm very interested in exploring how the potential of structural genetics as counter speech, and whether we can use them to block essentialist, the process of conveying essentialist beliefs through social genetics. And to end, I see this proposal, I mean, I find it interesting because I think it's an attempt to expand, or I see as an attempt to expand two areas of philosophy that I think need expansion. So one is linguistic and conceptual interventions. Think about metalinguistic negotiations, concept amelioration, there are many different kinds of projects there. So all these interventions are focused mostly on concepts, right? The meaning of the concept, specific concept with special meanings. But conceptual resources include much more than concepts. I think Haslanger has many times defined like conceptual resources as containing narratives, scripts, and I see also explanations about why things happen, explanations about why some individuals display certain properties and not others. So I think our linguistic and conceptual interventions should start taking into account also explanations and use them, like in this case, as complements to improve the way we talk. So I think attention to explanations of social observations and how those explanations influence how we interpret language and how we reason about categories should be part of all these projects of linguistic interventions. So I see our proposal as trying to do that. But also, I'm thinking about how our proposal is also something part of a bigger project we are working on within social epistemology. That is that, recent debates in social epistemology addressing, the ethics of knowledge practices, in particular knowledge production and knowledge distribution, are mostly focused on missing or deficient concepts, credibility attributions, and ignorance. But I see that there is something we also need to work on, which is the practices of explaining and the ethics of those practices. Because I think those practices are related to how we apply concepts, how we interpret genetics, and for example, questions like how can we cue or invite specific explanations that are gonna help us attain, a better society. I think we need to include explanation and the ethics of explanatory practices into these debates in social epistemology. So for example, what kind of things need an explanation? And why are some phenomena, social phenomena, triggering our curiosity in ways that, I need to explain that, and others do not? How should we react to that? What kind of work it needs to be done about that? And I think that's it. Do I have something else? No, I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Saray. That's a wonderful talk.